Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our membership eligibility charter school edition. Very excited to do this. My name is Bob George, Director of Employer Information Systems here at the MTRS, formerly charter school representative at the MTRS. So very excited we're doing this program today. On behalf of the board and our executive director, thank you for joining us today. Hopefully you'll find this really helpful and informative. So for today's program, this is what we're going to go through today. So we're going to go through, the training sessions we're offering for the whole summer. We're going to talk about employee eligibility, part of the statutes, how charter schools differ from some of the other rules. We'll talk about the eligibility regulation, which still applies to charter schools for a lot of positions, hiring a retiree if you're in that situation, and then registering your folks once you figure out who's eligible. So first, I just like to sort of count our way through the training sessions we're doing. So we have already gone through the first two training sessions. Those will be available online. Oh, I also failed to mention, if you look in the chat of this training presentation, there's a downloadable PDF if you'd like to print it out to take notes, or if you just want a copy of the slides as we're going through them. You can find that in the chat session for this training session. So for those of you who might be watching on video, after the fact, we will have that presentation downloadable with the video links as well. I don't know the exact structure of that yet, but we'll figure that out by the time we're getting them posted online. So if you're going through the series, again, we mark them through as we go through, just to make sure folks know we're on the third version of this, our third sort of step to our voyage. For folks who are going through it, you probably don't want to do eligibility and charter school eligibility. So if you're in a charter school, you want to be in this session. If you're in a non-charter school, you want to do the session before, just because we're going to focus on some very specific niche things in this session for charter schools. So with that, we'll get started. So before we get too deep into some of the specifics of the differentiation there, we're going to talk about some of the basics that are set up for membership eligibility. So we are a state agency, as was mentioned in last week's presentation. So we were established by Mass General Law, Chapter 32. And in Chapter 32, it also sets up the primary creation of what a teacher is in the definitions, in the definition section in Chapter 32, Section 1. Now, there are some other statutes that really come into play here. This is particularly true for charter schools. Charter schools were introduced with Mass General Law, Chapter 71, Section 89. Virtual schools, which are sometimes seen as being similar, they're not, but they were also created in Chapter 71. And then there are some other specific statutory language that creates other kinds of schools. We're doing the charter school one, so I'm not going to get as deep into those for this particular one. But in addition to the statutory language, we also have a membership regulation. And really that's to help sort of handle and clarify things that might not be as clear specifically in the statute, but you'll see that they work hand in hand. Now, in accordance with what a teacher is and membership in the public employee retirement system, right? So first, it's very clear in the definitions in Chapter 32 that somebody, to be eligible for the MTRS, you have to be regularly employed, okay? So this is for employees who are employed in some sort of a known basis. There's an expectation of regular employment there. And next, they have to be employed by a public school system. So charter schools are public schools, and therefore that's why they'd be eligible. Now, the person has to be employed on a basis of not less than half-time. So they can't sort of be like a consultant basis or haphazardly employed, day-by-day employment without a clear expectation. Now, the statute doesn't set any kind of set hours or a schedule or something, but there has to be an expectation of regular employment, and that's super important. And you're going to see that comes into play later as well. Now, we have some examples that also key into this not less than half-time situation. Sometimes you can have a superintendent, an executive director maybe that oversees a couple of charter schools, right? We do have grouped charter schools. Pioneer is one of them. Edward Brooke used to have a couple. So I know KIPP has a couple. So sometimes you can have one entity that's MTRS eligible, but they cover multiple schools. And if the combination of those multiple schools bring them over half-time, that's still sufficient. You could have an employee who works in one school or works in two schools. Maybe they work 40% in a charter school, and heck, maybe they work 20% in a municipal district, right? And so if the combination of those two employment periods, both of which would otherwise be eligible as a teacher, so they require licensure and stuff, they can meet the half-time eligibility. Okay, and I know I brought up licensure. We're going to get to that a little bit later, because obviously that's a little bit different in a charter school. Now, the statute also is very specific about some positions, right? School psychologists, psychiatrists, adjustment counselors, social workers, director of occupational guidance, principals, supervisors of teachers, which includes superintendent, assistant superintendents, executive directors for charter schools. We're going to mention that we put in some language to our eligibility regulation that kind of addresses that too. But these positions are going to be eligible by title, okay? But it's important. You have to have the title to be eligible by title. Funny how that works, right? And the other thing it must be very clear is that even though these folks are eligible by title, they still have to meet the other criteria that we just talked about. So they have to be regularly employed. They have to be working in a school district. So keep in mind that those two things, they all work in sync, or those two things all work in sync. Now, for folks that are not eligible by position, first and foremost, no one's ever disqualified by their position. Now, sometimes we might jump the gun a little bit and say, well, these positions are probably not eligible. Probably is going to be the key word there. Probably is because they typically don't meet the eligibility criteria. But I don't care what someone's position is. If they meet the eligibility criteria, they're eligible for the MTRS, right? So while there can be some positions that we don't have to apply certain criteria to, nobody's ever disqualified by title. So in addition to what's in the statute, we also have a membership regulation, and we're going to talk about that just in a moment. But some of sort of the hot topic positions, right? So BCBAs, athletic directors, ROTC instructors, long-term subs or nurses, those are very common positions we get a lot of questions about. And really what it comes down to is, do those folks meet the eligibility criteria? They're not eligible by title, not unless there's a statutory change coming we don't know about. So those folks would apply to our eligibility regulation. Now, we're going to talk about that in just a moment, but I want to talk about a little bit of the difference of how things work at a charter school versus a non-charter school. So in charter schools, again, charter schools were introduced with Mass General Law, Chapter 71, Section 89. Why? And there are two types of charter schools: Commonwealth and Horace Mann charter schools. So Commonwealth charter schools being independent charter schools, Horace Mann charter schools being a part of a school district. Okay. Now the Horace Mann charter schools, they're going to be within a district. They're going to be reporting to us within that district. They're city employees, if you will. Now the Commonwealth charter schools, that's a standalone district, and so they'll be reporting to us as a distinct employer. Okay. Now, per Chapter 71 subsection, per Chapter 7189Y, where charter schools are established, there's a couple of bits of very specific language that are going to interestingly apply to the MTRS. So first, teachers in a charter school shall be subject to the teacher's retirement system. Boy, that's pretty clear. And their service shall be considered creditable service within the meaning thereof. All right. So what this does, this is where the uniqueness of charter schools come about. And I'm going to explain that after I get to the third one here, but we'll come back to this. So each local district will be required to grant a leave of absence to any teacher in a charter school. This is interesting because this can cause crossover between the different employers for our members, right? Any non-charter school teacher who would like to take a leave of absence of up to 2 years, their district's required to let them if they want to become a charter school teacher for a year or two. Now, sometimes charter schools don't know this. It might be an interesting recruitment tool for you. But if they want to go and join a charter school and see what it's like, or see if they can learn things in the charter school environment that they feel might be important to bring back to the municipal district environment, the law literally specifically allows for it. Now, the third is that no teacher in a Commonwealth charter school who is not certified can be hired unless they're required to take the MTEL, right? So they have to pass the state teacher test as required in 30AG to be a teacher in a non-charter school. And that's right in the law that establishes charter schools. So you're going to see, we're going to come back to leaning on that when we're trying to figure out, because, one of our themes always is that, MTRS doesn't figure out who a teacher is. The statute and DESE tells us who a teacher is, right? So we're going to come back to the statutory language at times to do some charter school evaluations. We're going to get into that in just 1 second. And I can't say enough now. It says teachers in a charter school shall be subject to the teacher's retirement system. So there are going to be times if we have a position and it's not clear that that person's a teacher. Now, if you have a math teacher and they're working full time, no one's going to ask this question, right? I think we all know what classroom teachers are. But this is going to be for the teacher positions that are outside of that, right? Again, things to sort of think about and process in what we're going through so far. Now, membership eligibility is slightly different for charter school employees because there's a whole group of employees that would be eligible in a charter school that aren't necessarily or wouldn't necessarily be eligible through a municipal district because of licensure. But the statute trumps our membership regulation. And that's why I'm even presenting it in this order in our presentation today. Okay. So charter school employees, just to get a couple of things out of the way, if they're eligible by title, so they meet the first criteria we're talking about, they're eligible by title, they're regularly employed, they're not less than half-time, they're already in. So even though charter schools have some differing eligibility rules, if somebody's in by title, they're still in. The fact that they work in a charter school doesn't somehow disqualify them, okay? Directors, superintendent, principals, positions of that nature that are eligible by title, also in charter schools, right? So that works exactly the same for a charter school as it would for a non-charter school. So you don't have to worry about it becoming more complicated. Now, charter school members who meet our eligibility criteria, now I know we haven't gone into this yet, but if someone meets our regulation, again, and they're working in a charter school, they're not somehow excluded because they're in a charter school. So if they meet either the statutory requirements or our regulatory requirements, they're in just like they would be in a municipal district. What's going to be a little extra in a charter school is that there are positions that are going to allow for the position for the person to be working in to be eligible in a charter school when it would not be eligible in a municipal district. And that basically is going to be a parallel comparison. Okay, so basically, if charter school teachers, classroom teachers, per the statute, are not required to have a DESE license. They are required to take the test, though, so that's going to be important that you're implementing that. That's more of a DESE issue. But if they're a classroom teacher, we're going to know how that works and we're going to accept them, okay? But as a general rule, a teacher is for a charter school is any position that would typically require licensure in a municipal district. We're going to extend that parallel qualification to those positions. So a school nurse, typically school nurses are required to be DESE licensed in non-charter schools. So a school nurse who is not required to have a license in a charter school is MTRS eligible. They still have to meet the statutory requirements of being regularly employed and not less than half-time. I can't say that enough, okay? But if they're not licensed in a charter school and they're in a position that's very clearly a position that requires licensure in a non-charter school, a municipal district, then they're going to be allowed to be in. Now, for the purpose of evaluating that position, if we're evaluating a position, we want to make sure it's typically requires license in a non-charter school. Title's going to matter, right? Like we have to be careful. There's a lot of gray area here. So I was in a discussion with somebody and they had a position, I'm going to call it the chief people person. I might be getting this slightly off, right? And so we were saying, no, I mean, based on this, they look like a human resources official, and human resources officials are typically not required to have a license. Okay. Then the director came back to me and said, well, no, they're really an assistant superintendent. Well, no, they're not, because they're not the assistant superintendent. So if you give her the title assistant superintendent for human resources, then she's an assistant superintendent. And so we went back and forth a little bit. And then ultimately he's like, okay, great. We intended for it to be an assistant superintendent. We are legally going to change her position to assistant superintendent. She had already met the regularly employed. She was already half-time. So we said, welcome to the MTRS. Exactly. Now she's eligible by title. She's not even in the parallel comparison anymore, right? So these sorts of things matter. Okay, so just keep that in mind. You're setting up your positions. You want to have a better idea. If your intention is to have somebody be an assistant superintendent, this is not a position naming contest. Please name them as an assistant superintendent. If you have a position and you've made up some amazingly creative title for it, and then you come to us and you try and argue that they're a guidance counselor, well, we cannot apply that parallel to this amazing new position you have if we cannot very clearly distinguish that they're a guidance counselor. Help us help you. Make the position a guidance counselor. But you can still give them their sort of parallel duties and this new thing you want them to do on top of what they already do. But if you're trying to argue to us, oh, no, they're the same thing as a guidance counselor, then your position should be set up as a guidance counselor. Again, we can't go too far. We get audited too, and we need to make sure that we're only including folks that are legally eligible in the system. Okay, so this is a challenge for us. One of the other questions that you might see for certain positions that we're going to ask is, okay, you're trying to say that this position runs parallel to another position. Do you require them to take the DESI the DESI test? Well, no. Okay, so you're saying that they would, this is a position that would parallel a licensed position. Yes. Okay. Do you require them to take the DESI test? Well, no. Well, I mean, if we go up a couple, right? You can't hire a teacher unless they successfully pass the DESI test, right? So you can't argue they're a teacher in one position and then not follow the criteria that would apply to a teacher. Okay. Now, you might have thought to yourself, well, geez, we didn't know we had to do that. Okay, well then do it, right? And then the conversation going forward will be much easier for all of us. If it's truly an educational position, now I had one where they were like, well, look, we didn't put it in all the descriptions, but man, we are definitely going to hire somebody with teaching experience who, okay. So require them to take the teacher's test, list in the fact that they had to be a previous teacher. Geez, you're going to make that evaluation pretty easy for the MTRS. Okay, you require tons of teaching service and you're requiring them to take the MTEL as part of the job. Welcome to the MTRS, right? So these criteria they're in the statute. Again, we're a state agency. We're just looking to follow the law. Okay, so it's very important that you think about these sorts of things when planning out. Now, you have a question on a position. Nobody's asking about your full-time math teacher, right? Everybody knows that. So nobody's asking about the executive director because they work directly for the school and all that kind of stuff. Great. However, you might have some other positions you have some questions on, right? So if you do, please don't just send us an email saying, hey, is blah, blah, blah eligible? I don't know. One of the things what we're going to require, we're going to typically ask for the job description for the position because it tends to have the hiring requirements and the job duties. So please have that put together. If you're put together a job description and it doesn't have the hiring requirements, A, work on doing that better. B, send us something else that has the hiring requirements in it. So if you have a job description, maybe it was posted internally and folks had a general idea of what was required, try to get that information in there. Now, the job description is not a magical document. We're picking that because it typically has the information we need to make the proper legal evaluation. So just make sure we get all the information we need. One of the things that's always helpful to let us know is, as part of this process, do you require them to take the DESI teacher's license, right? So sometimes you do a great job, you get us all the job descriptions. Hey, I've got my whole pile here, and then we end up having to go back and ask about all of them. Okay, so based on this position, it doesn't really meet the sliding criteria. It's not eligible by title. Do you require them to take the teacher's test? So if you can give us that information up front, it will help us be more efficient and hopefully get you back an answer in a more efficient manner. We've also bulked up our staff, so we're trying to do our best to try and meet everyone's needs as quickly as we can. So hopefully this kind of explains some of that exception. And now I'm going to turn to Scott for some questions.
Yes, our teacher assistants are not required to be DESI licensed. Are they MTRS eligible?
So since they're not, it sounds like they're not required to be licensed, but they're also not required to take the test. And so again, they're not eligible. They're not ineligible because of title, because nobody is, but by criteria, they're not eligible. They are also not typically eligible in municipal districts. So for the same exact reasons that we're saying for you guys, typically teachers assistants in municipal districts do not require licensure. So they're not going to be eligible in charter schools for the exact same reasons. All right. I think that's all we had for questions for now. So we're going to go on to the next section. So I mentioned before, so we have the eligibility criteria that very specifically applies to charter schools, right? But the membership eligibility regulation itself, which changed in April of 2022, that still applies to charter schools. There's lots of information in this that still applies to a charter school. So charter schools have the statutory qualifications that help them get in. You have the charter school exception, where we're going to extend it to certain positions based on adherence to Chapter 71. And then on top of that, we have our membership regulation, which applies to everybody, right? So a lot of what was in the membership regulation did not change. Okay, we do have some slight changes, like, we call DESI now. They used to be called DOE in the old regulation, which was what their old name was a very long time ago. So we fixed some of that stuff. We changed certification and licensure. But there was also some other structural changes that we made in reaction to primarily to a court case, but some other factors as well. So let's talk about some of these things. So one of the things that did not change, I know I talked about all the people that were eligible by title. Our regulation does not change the statute. Okay, so that's very important. I just want to make sure we bring this up. Everybody who's eligible by title before or after the statute, All that works exactly the same. Everybody who is eligible at title still has to meet the regularly employed, et cetera, et cetera. No changes there. I'm basically just covering this to make sure that that part is clear. So inside of our regulation, we have 4 eligibility criteria. In the 4 eligibility criteria, this really sets up for folks that are eligible if their position's not eligible by title. Again, in charter schools, you have the exception where you might have somebody who slides in otherwise, but it's also important to know these criteria, because if you have employees that meet these 4 eligibility criteria, heck, you don't even have to review the rest of the part, right? So I'm going to start at the bottom. And the first one is that their contractual agreement requires a condition that they be licensed, right? So if you are hiring somebody and they're contractually required to have a DESE license, in charter schools, you still have to do that if you have any special ed teachers, right? So if you require them to have a DESE license as a matter of being employed, it is required, okay? That's going to be an important criteria. The next one is that their service not be less than half time. That should sound familiar. Our regulation mirrors the statute. Next, the contractual employment is with a school or school committee. Okay, you're in the school department or work for the public school. Again, awfully familiar, mirrors the statute. And then last but not least, if you require them to have a license, guess what? They have to have a license. Oh, well, okay, that makes sense, right? So if you have D, you kind of have to have A. So you can't say they're required to have a license and then they just don't have one, right? So this is less important in a charter school for, say, classroom teachers. It's going to be more important for administrative positions, obviously for special ed, because charter schools are still required to have special ed licensure for special ed teachers. And sometimes you just decide, hey, if I'm going to have a director of curriculum, I want to make sure that they're DESE licensed. If you do that, you don't have to worry about the whole parallel process, right? They're eligible because they meet the core criteria that everybody does. So there's no exclusion to charter school people that would apply based on the fact that you do get sort of a little bit of extra inclusion. And then just a couple things to help, I'm going to say clarify, just a little additional information on those 4 eligibility criteria. First of all, licensure must be a condition of employment. It can't be, this isn't eligible. This isn't it'd be nice if they were licensed. Yeah, right? It has to be a requirement. Next, employee has been granted a license, a licensure waiver or an emergency license, right? That's another one that's relatively new. If DESE is saying they're good enough to be a teacher, MTRS agrees. DESE tells us who a teacher is. So if they give a waiver saying someone's good, we treat that like it's licensure. They may have to renew it more frequently or whatever, but it's not the MTRS's job to tell you who a teacher is. DESE does. Okay. Now, teachers who are pending licensure. So if somebody's going through their process and they're, you require them to have the licensure and they're just in the process and DESE says it's okay to hire them while they're going through that, welcome to the MTRS. Okay. Again, we're mirroring their process. They tell us who teachers are. And for the last piece of this, for primary employment, contracts do not have to be written. Okay. So it's very common in charter schools that you don't have necessarily full formal employment contracts. However, legally, there is something called the employment contract. And what essentially that means is there's an understanding, an expectation that the person is going to show up, they're going to provide work product. And for that, you're going to pay them. And they're going to show up regularly. And there's some sort of expectation, 3 days a week, 5 days a week, between these hours, however it works. That is called the employer contract. And that does still apply for the purpose of having a contract in our eligibility criteria. Hopefully that makes sense.
We have a human resources manager who we want to have MTRS eligible, and we change their title to Executive Director of Human Resources and Finance Operations. Are they now eligible by title and also a updated job description?
So the question is, if you had somebody so first of all, we're not going to get into the coaching of making people eligible. However, hypothetically, let's say we had a school district and they had an HR person and they really see them as being an upper part of the executive staff. So I would say making someone the executive director of a department is not the same thing as being the executive director. However, assistant superintendent for human resources and people or whatever, something along those lines that starts out with the words assistant superintendent, that makes them awfully eligible under the statute. So maybe something to consider. Any other questions? Cool. Okay. So along with the eligibility criteria, it goes on a little bit. There are a couple of other things in here. One of them I think you're going to find probably a little bit funny. So first is individuals who are granted DESE licensure and they're the director of an ed collab. So EdCo labs, we've always considered them to be superintendents. The DESE considers them to be superintendents. We just want to make sure we put that one in. I just thought it was funny because someone just asked me about the executive director of an HR department. Keep in mind, being the head of the school and being the executive director of a department, which technically goes against the definition of executive director, but those would be different or distinct. Now, eligibility criteria 2. So this is really about employing people who are working in a mass charter school, an innovation school at Quincy College. So here we talk about the definition of teachers in these positions, holds a title of teacher, eligibility criteria are set forth, and works in a position would be eligible membership if performed in a Massachusetts public school. So this third bullet here is what applies to charter schools, right? And that's going to be how we do this position in parallel, okay? And so this empowers us to say, you know, okay, it says teacher. We know that they meant the definition of teacher, and then the definition of teacher is formally broken out with licensure. And then it says you can also have teachers that are non-licensed. So this is us trying to do our best to adhere to the statutory language in Chapter 32 and Chapter 71, blend them together and make sure we're following the rules and everybody's on the same page. So that's what that third bullet is really strong for charter schools. It allows us to so hopefully meet the spirit of the law of the charter school process and why charter schools were established. And here under the 2C, under the eligibility criteria, this is where we're going to talk about intervening separation of service. So this is going to be an important thing. We're going to talk about this a couple slides down. So I just want to touch on this. This is where we're trying to make sure it's very clear to folks that if someone who drops below halftime, they're regularly employed, and there's no break in service, no separation of service, they're going to remain an MTRS member, okay? But if there is a separation of service, there's going to be a reevaluation. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, what is a separation of service? Don't worry, we have that coming up. So we're going to talk about that in a couple slides, okay? So we'll get to that part, but I want to make sure that there's a reference in here in our regulation that basically says if somebody can remain eligible for the MTRS as long as there hasn't been a separation of service. And we're going to talk about exactly what that is when we get to the definition. So in the regulation, as I just mentioned, there's some definitions. And so one of them is going to be separation of service. It's next, but I'm going to talk about a couple others first. Teacher position. That is referring to a position that is that meets the eligibility criteria for a teacher for the MTRS, okay? And we're going to refer to it later as far as like someone switching from a non-teacher position to a teacher position, or from a teacher position to a non-teacher position. So it's clear that you understand. And we're trying to say teacher position so that it's clear we're not only talking about classroom teachers. It's basically everybody who meets the definition of teacher under the statute. Day-by-day employment. So day-by-day is kind of just basically not regularly employed. So there's no fixed expectation of when the person's going to be there. They're haphazardly employed, or working on a consultant basis. There's no clear understanding of an expectation of when the person's going to work. Okay, short-term employment. That's going to be anything less than 6 months, right? So if you have somebody, let's say they're covering somebody that would be an MTRS eligible member, they're only going to cover them for like 6 weeks. That's not going to be enough service to qualify them for the MTRS. Like, they don't get in the door that way, and then they remain eligible. That sort of thing. We're looking to pull people in that are going to be in an employment situation that's longer term than 6 months. So anything less than 6 months is being excluded as short-term employment. Now, if you have somebody who's already MTRS eligible and they're going into a new position, we're going to talk about that a little bit with the separation of service. So we'll get into that one actually literally right now. So here's the bigger one. This is separation of service. Now, it was important we did the other ones first, not only because they're listed that way in the statute, but we're going to refer to a couple of those other definitions. So it was important to make sure that we kind of explain them first, right? So separation of service. It occurs at the moment they cease to be regularly employed in a teacher position with their employer. There's teacher position again, and regularly employed. Again, the thing we mentioned right in the beginning, because that's what the statute requires. So this happens when a few different things happen. So if they resign, if they don't get reelected or reappointed, right? If they're removed or discharged, aka fired. Their commencement of service in a position other than the teacher position. Again, that's where teacher position becomes important. They take a job that's not considered a teacher position. They're severing their MTRS service because they're taking a job that's not a teacher. Okay, and they're agreeing to do this. This is a, a choice, hopefully. But if they're taking that position, that's a redefinition of whether or not they should be eligible for the system. Okay. Commencement of day-to-day or short-term employment. So somebody who is an MTRS member, they're full-time, and now maybe they have a life situation going on. They're only going to be haphazardly employed for a little while. They're going to work lightly as a consultant, something like that. Okay, that's not going to be MTRS eligible because they're taking a position that's either day-to-day or it's short-term. Again, that's why we talked about those definitions before we got in here. And then the next definition is going to be about leave of absence, right? So if it's we're going to talk about the leave of absence topic overall in its own section, right? That's going to be in the creditable service training. However, just lightly, if you have somebody who's on leave of absence, if their leave of absence is going to be longer than a year, then they're not going to be an eligible member anymore. Going longer than a year on unpaid leave of absence is going to disqualify them for membership. Now, there is an exception to that, and there are two. The first one is if that leave of absence is longer than a year because of a medical condition, okay? So somebody's battling illness, they're going to be out for 18 months or whatever the situation is. Okay, well, that's different. That's not an unpaid leave because they're opting into something that's medically related. There's a specific exception in the statute. If somebody's on workers' comp, by the way, is another example, that's a whole different set of rules. We're going to talk about that in the creditable service, but you're going to see that that's why those have distinct markers in the system when you're listing people on leave of absence. All right. So if somebody's going on an unpaid leave and it's not medical, they're going to sever membership if it's greater than a year. Okay. Now, when we say greater than a year, I also want to make sure we're going to have a note about the summer when we talk about this. But if they go out and technically it's like a year and 2 days because school started 2 days later than it did last year, no, that's just a year. Okay, so the summer doesn't get held as a weapon against people. But if they miss the first day of school the next year, or they're not regularly employed by the first day of school next year, then that could change things. Okay, but ultimately, if they're on a leave of absence for longer, that's one of the disqualifiers. Now, the other one is that if they go on leave of absence to be a full-time union member. Now, charter schools, there aren't a lot of unions in charter schools. I think there are only two. But if someone were a full-time union member, then they can remain eligible because the statute allows for it. So I'm not aware of that applying anywhere. I'm not going to get too deep into that. And last, the best reason to sever membership is retirement. We all hope to get there. So retirement definitely severs their active membership. Of course, they're our retiree at that point. So don't worry, we still love them. We're paying them, but they're technically not an active member at that point, and they are severing employment to do so. Now, when it comes to if there's been a separation of service, again, the summer, right? So teachers aren't teaching over the summer. So the summer's not held against people for the purposes of calculating an exact year, or if there are other things that happen because they're not at work, right? So occasionally you might have a situation where budgets are really tight and you're like, oh man, we're going to have to let go of a couple of teachers. So you let one of them know, look, I'm sorry, we just, we don't have the funds to fund your position for this year, and it's in the summer. And then you solve that problem. Maybe somebody else retires or they resign, or you find out somebody else is leaving, go to another employer, and you're like, oh geez, we can go, call Debbie and let her know that we can bring her back. So if all of that happens before the start of the school year, right, it's like getting fired on a Saturday. It doesn't happen. So it doesn't qualify if they have not missed a day of work. If it gets solved 3 days after the school year starts, then their reevaluation for membership and all that kind of stuff, they technically have severed. They would have to requalify for membership. They'd have to re-enroll, all that sort of stuff. So just keep in mind that the summer is never a weapon against the teacher. It's just how it works. Teachers don't work in the summer. So hopefully this explanation, all this in the definitions, will help some of those evaluations. Now, there are a couple of other positions I just wanted to quickly touch on, and one of them is coach-only members. So if you have somebody who's a coach, but they work as a teacher in another school district, so they're concurrently eligible because they were eligible through their main job, and now they're only working as a coach for you. We're going to talk about why that's eligible, but you should enroll those people to have MTRS deductions taken. Full-time union reps, again, not a lot of unions in charter schools. I'm just going to glaze past that one. If you have any folks that are foreign exchange teachers working in a charter school program, I'm not aware of there being any in charter schools, but please know that there's no exception for them, but I'm not going to get too deep into it. And then last but not least, if you have occupational or physical therapists working in a charter school, they are allowed to use allied health professional licensure for eligibility as opposed to DESE licensure. Those are the only two positions that we accept it for. And we're grandfathering in a decision by the MTRS that was made in the 1990s, okay? But it only applies to those two positions. And please keep in mind, if they're legally working as an OT or PT, they have to have that license anyway. So those two things go hand in hand. All right, we're gonna go for some questions.
Okay, we got two.
Cool.
If a teacher retires but returns to work part-time, can they continue being an MTRS contributing member?
We're going to talk about retirees in the next section, so I'm just going to punt that question for now.
Okay. I feel unclear on the title roles and eligibility, such as Director of Operations or Director of Talent. I am new to charter schools. I have one Director of Operations who is paying into MTRS and one who is not with the same title. Is there a clear directive of what charter school leader roles, such as the Director of Operations or Director of Talent, are these considered MTRS eligible, and where are the guidelines for these types of positions?
Okay, so great question. So the executive director, meaning the AKA superintendent of your school district, is going to be automatically eligible by title. Those other positions sound like we need to do a position review for them. So we need a copy of their job description sent in to us, and I would connect with your assigned employer services representative to go through that process. That's the exact process where we're going to look to see if they mirror, are they required to have a DESE license, for instance, for those positions? That would be something to find out. If they're not required to, are they required to take the MTEL test, right? So we need that information as well as their job description, and we can definitely give you a very specific answer. The answer by title, those positions are not eligible by title, but it doesn't mean they don't qualify. We need to find out just more details on them. Hopefully that's helpful. And I promise for the working after retirement, it's literally the next section. So, all right, we good?
Okay.
Awesome. So there's a temporary wait. Okay, so because short-term employment is no longer eligible based on the regulation, you're not going to run into a lot of situations where long-term subs are an issue. However, if you do have someone start and they're part-time and they've never had any MTRS service, they are subject to a 6-month wait. This is right in the statute. We don't have any control over it. So we do not require, so let's say you're hiring somebody and they're temporary, right? But you're hiring them for past 7 months. So short-term employment's not a problem. And you're just saying, well, I'm hiring them this year, but I'm not sure if I'm going to bring them back indefinitely. Because it's greater than 6 months, we don't consider that temporary, okay? Like you can't hire somebody for 10 years and call them temporary. So anything greater than 6 months, the temporary rule does not apply to them. If they are part-time though, they could be subject to the 6-month wait. If they have prior MTRS service or prior service with another retirement system, and I know that's not really a thing in the charter schools, but that would exclude them immediately. So they're already in the pension system. There's no need to put them on 6-month wait. Hopefully that helps. And that kind of rolls into our long-term sub situation. You're kind of looking at the same stuff. So long-term subs aren't somehow excluded for being long-term subs. The real question is, do they meet the other criteria, right? And when we're applying them here, we do talk about DESE licensure, but the same sort of parallel eligibility criteria and all that sort of stuff apply to long-term subs the same way they do all of your other positions. So that's what it really comes down to. Are they, in a position that requires them to be employed longer than 6 months? Do you require a DESE license? If you're not requiring a DESE license, I'm presuming they're not eligible by title. So therefore, the question is, do you require them to take the MTEL? Okay, and if there are any questions on any of those, just like I was mentioning before, if you don't have positions that are eligible by title, they're not eligible immediately by looking at our 4 eligibility criteria in the regulation, then you should reach out to us with a chart with a description and whether or not you require them to take the MTEL as a condition of employment. All right, so that's all the qualifications before we get to retiree. Do we have any questions?
We do have one more. It's a list of titles. Is Director of Finance, Business Manager, CFO, Business Admin Assistant, and Business Manager eligible by title?
So I'm going to say business manager is a pretty quick, direct relation, and all of those other positions we need to go through the review process for, because it's not going to be clear for all of those other positions. There's so much variance in what they are For instance, the director of finance might actually more so parallel a city treasurer. And of course, we need to know the other questions, right? Do you require them to take an MTEL as a requirement of employment? That sometimes can be a really strong trump card. So please gather that information and send it along to your assigned employer services representative. We'll do our best to try and get you an answer as quickly as we can. All right, so retirees. So I know somebody asked this, as I promised, we are going to cover it. So let's say you want to hire a retiree. So by a retiree, we don't just mean somebody who's retired from some industry somewhere. We're talking about a public retiree, somebody who's retired from either the MTRS or another public mass public retirement system. If they've retired outside of Massachusetts, none of the stuff applies. Okay, so there are earnings limits for mass public retirees. They cannot work more than 1,200 hours in a calendar year. I know that's really weird for schools because you're like, well, we don't do calendar years. You have to figure it out by calendar year. How many are going to work? So if you're doing a school year, how many do they work between July and December? And then how much are they going to work between January and June? Their earnings cannot be more than the difference between what they would have made had they not retired and what they're getting as a pension. So if they would have made 100,000 as a whatever position that they had not retired from or had retired from, pardon me, and then now they're getting 60 grand as their pension benefit, you have a $40,000 gap that they can make as a retiree. So hopefully they're working part-time, that sort of thing. Now, if they've been retired for an entire January to December cycle, so they have to be retired for an entire calendar year, even though, again, I know that's counterintuitive for school employees. So for most people, they've been retired for 18 months by the time that happens. However, that's what the law says, right? It's written for all public employees. So if it's an entire January to December calendar passes and they're a retiree, then on top of the $40,000 from my previous equation, they get another $15,000 added to the pile as eligible to be earned. Okay. So if an employee is going to return to the same employer that they are retiring from, there may be a 60-day requirement, a federal requirement, that they be separated for 60 days before returning to work. But that gets waived if they're 62 or if they're at a max benefit when they're retiring. Okay, so if they choose option C, that doesn't get rid of the max benefit part. If they would be under a max benefit under option A, that can be waived. If you're pulling in a retiree that retired from somebody else, you don't have to worry about the 60-day thing, but you do have to worry about the hours and the earnings. Okay, now in addition to that, some other things that you need to know. For instance, a retiree. Now, sometimes somebody might be retired and they get an offer they just can't refuse. It's going to be over their limits. However, they can place their retirement benefit on hold and then they can earn whatever they want with no restrictions, right? So we had some of these recently. I had somebody who just came off of a leave from one of the school districts I was dealing with. She really missed being an administrator. She got an opportunity where they basically showed up at her house with like literally a bag of cash. And she was like, sure, I'll go work there. And so she placed her retirement benefit on hold to make sure she was legal. And when she completed that year, she let us know ahead of time she was leaving the position and she could restart her benefit. She has to leave. Once somebody places their benefit on hold to work, though, they do have to leave the position before we can turn the benefit back on. Now, if you hire a retiree and they're coming back to work, they're a sub or whatever, they are not required to have any retirement deductions. That's right. Retirees do not pay retirement deductions. They are not required to pay Social Security. They are not required to pay into a local board. I don't think any charters have local boards except maybe Alma Del Mar. And they're not required to pay MTRS. They are eligible to pay into an electionary thing. So if you're in the SMART plan or something and they want to pay, they can pay it from wages and that's legal. So, but they're not required to have any deductions. Now, this is a very rare case, but there is a situation where members can reinstate. Maybe they retired really young. They were going to move to Florida or something. Then they came back and they're like, wow, it's hot down there. So they come back and they say, look, I'd like to reinstate. There's a whole complicated process. They have to pay a ton of money back. I think there have only been less than 20 people have ever done this. So it's really rare, but it's possible. And then just a couple other things to remind people of. If somebody is working as a retiree, there are no restrictions if they're in the private sector, if they're working out of Massachusetts, or if they work for the federal government. We're not saying they can never have a job. We're just saying they can't have a public job in Massachusetts. They need to be very careful if they're working for a private sector agency where they're providing public service, though. So if it's sort of like a, hey, we'll have you work for this place and then you can be a consultant into the school district, that can be dangerous. And there have been situations where people lose their pensions over that stuff. If they're really working for the public in Massachusetts, they can't get around it by pretending that they're a contractor or working for some private company. So if you think of it from a, let's say, construction point of view, it would be okay for a retiree who retires and then joins some construction company. And that construction company happens to pave a street for a town, right? And then the next week they go and I don't know, they build a building somewhere, right? So the fact that they happen to pave a public street one day, it's just coincidence. There's no control by the school, any of that kind of stuff. But if it's a situation where they're a quasi-employee, they're going to get in trouble, and the school might get in trouble too. So make sure you're staying away from those sorts of agreements. And then one last thing, and then we'll take some questions on retirees. There are different rules that apply for people if they're under what's called a critical shortage. So there is a provision in the law where a school can say, look, we're really in a bind. We need to bring in this retiree because we can't find anybody else. Right now, if someone's retired under Retirement Plus, they might not be eligible for a critical shortage for the first couple of years. So that's something you definitely have to think about. But DESE can create or issue a license, basically, that allows for the school year for that person to be retired, collect their benefit, and still work without restrictions. One of the examples, my go-to example, there was a superintendent who died tragically young. And it just happened on a weekend. And now you have a big school district and they have no superintendent. So DESE calls up the old superintendent and says, hey, look, I know you retired a couple years ago from the school district. Would you mind covering them? Just, like the new superintendent passed away this weekend. And that retired superintendent was able to go back to their old school district, jump right in the office, and just be superintendent until they could find a suitable replacement. Right now, that's an example of, it didn't take very long for them to get a critical shortage waiver, and obvious emergency situation, right? So now if you apply for a critical shortage waiver to DESE for, say, I don't know, an English teacher, they might send you one. So, it's not an easy criteria to meet. You have to prove that you've put forth an extraordinary effort to find somebody who was qualified that wasn't a retiree. And that whole process happens with DESE. They just let us know if it's happened or not. And then last but not least, if you're employing any retired teachers, for goodness sake, fill out the calculator that we have in the MTRS portal, print it out, save a copy for your records because it protects you as an employer. Okay, it helps you do the calculation because it'll tell you what their pension is, by the way. You get the retiree to tell you what their pension would be or what their earnings would be had they not retired from their old employer. It does the calc for you. It'll figure in the $15,000 if needed, so you don't have to worry about whether or not that applies. And it provides a statement that you both sign that both of you fully understand the situation. And that way, if your retiree violates the rules or something, you have a legal document saying, hey, we had an agreement. You knew what was going on. And the reason I bring that up is because if you violate and you pay them more than you're supposed to, you're on the hook to take that money back. Good luck. So you are required to recuperate the overpayment made to the retiree. That is an ugly situation and you do not want to be in it. And for districts that are in a situation where they flagrantly violate or violate multiple times, you might have DESE coming and ask questions too, and nobody wants that, right? So let's just make sure we all stay within bounds. Everybody's doing what they're supposed to, and we should be in a good spot. So with that, are there any questions?
We do have questions. First one is, I am the business manager. So your answer to the question about those positions and eligibility stopped me. I had given up on the idea I might be eligible. Are you saying that the business manager is?
Yes.
Okay.
Because DESE requires business managers to be very clearly, that's a pretty quick, specifically if you have the title business manager, yeah, you're in. That one's pretty straightforward. I'm going to presume, of course, you probably work 70 hours a week, but you're required to be full-time. You're working directly for the school department, not some outside agency or something. Yeah, you're eligible, and we probably need to work with you to figure out how long you've been eligible because you're probably eligible retroactively.
Second part from the same person. If retirees want to pay into Social Security, is there any reason they shouldn't? I've asked retirees working in our school and some want to continue paying in. I guess if they haven't started collecting yet. Others are fine not paying.
Okay, so if they want to pay into Social Security, they're a retired annuitant, and I don't think they qualify for Social Security. Um, I think that's actually a better question for the Social Security Administration. Make sure it's clear to them that the person is what they refer to as a retired annuitant, and I believe that they don't qualify for Social Security through your employment. But I'm a little uncomfortable answering that specific of a question about Social Security qualification. I can tell you that they're not required to do it, and I'm not aware of there any provision, of there being a provision under Social Security, but that's not what I do. And so I think your question would be better addressed to the Social Security Administration. Sorry.
Okay. Who is responsible for tracking income limits on a retiree? The employer or the employee?
The answer is both. And that's why you have the document that you're supposed to be filling out in MTRS. If you go through that document, the template's pretty straightforward. Technically, as the employer, you're legally required to A, not allow them to violate the rule, and B, go back and recuperate anything you overpay them. And again, a flagrant disregard for that rule could end up in a very uncomfortable conversation with DESE. You don't want to be in that position. Now, DESE will be understanding. We're all understanding of situations where people get confused. Okay, we had a violation once where a guy was working as a substitute. He was doing a great job tracking his substitute time. Then he didn't realize that being a part-time dispatcher at the local police department should have been calculated in. Now, our form says it, and it wasn't until he saw our form and he's like, oh, geez, I wouldn't qualify that in, right? Now, that guy went over by, it really wasn't a lot of money to pay back. But it also meant that he immediately, for the rest of that calendar year, couldn't be employed. So it's important that you go through that process, sit down with your retiree, fill out that paperwork, and then if there are questions, please let us know. We're not looking to hunt down people who accidentally go over by $50. This isn't the kind of thing we're trying to do. But we've also seen some gross violations of these rules that turn into court cases, very publicly embarrassing things, and could technically lead to you losing your charter, and nobody wants that. Okay, awesome. So I'm trying to keep pace for time. I'm doing better than last time. All right. So once you figured out who's eligible, there's a registration process. Registration is required by law. New members should be registered as part of your onboarding process by your HR department or whoever handles HR at the school district. Eligible members must be registered so that you can load your MTRS reports. We're not going to let them come in if we don't know who these people are. New employees, you want to also make sure you're adding them into your payroll software properly. Make sure they're coded properly. If you have people who are switching jobs, maybe they were para and they were in Social Security, now they're becoming a classroom teacher. Shoot, make sure you get that payroll code. Those are the most dangerous situations to accidentally forget that step. So please make sure you're being mindful of that. And when you're entering their registrations, make sure you're listing their MTRS eligible position start date. So if they started 5 years ago and they're in a non-MTRS eligible position, and now they're starting now for a teacher job or something else that's MTRS eligible, your start date really is centered on when they became eligible for us. Okay, so make sure you're using that start date in that process. When you're hiring somebody who's MTRS eligible, they're not in Social Security. So the Social Security Administration requires you to fill out a form called an SSA 1945. I can't believe I forgot the name of the form for a minute there. And so the SSA 1945 is basically a form where you're disclosing to the employee while you're working here, you're not going to be in the Social Security benefit. So they fill out their part, you fill out something completing it. They're going to have their name. Please make sure it's legible. Now, when it says employee ID, do not let them put in their charter school employee ID. We don't know what that means. M6543. Great. That's a useless number to us. What we need is either their Social Security number, which is what the SSA was really intending, or you can put their MTRS membership number. That's perfectly fine too. And you're going to see in a couple slides where you can find that if you need to. Next, they put in their name. Please ask them to make sure that it's eligible or legible. And then last but not least, the employer ID is your 4-digit MTRS membership, MTRS employer code. So if you're Abby Kelly, it's 4140, for instance. Okay, so you want to make sure you're putting in that 4-digit code for an employer. Now, when you're going to register your employees, you need to have some information available, right? Their DESE licensure, or even just the fact that they have to take the test. All that information should be available and ready for when you're doing the registration. Make sure you've collected all this data. Now, when you're going to register your employees, you're doing it right in MTRS. You're going to go to the home screen. I know this is a little small for some of you watching, but we have the link right on the home page. It's going to bring you into a wizard. It seems like our software does everything in a wizard these days. So it has multiple steps. First step, you're going to put in their social security number. You're going to hit next. You're going to see that it immediately masks itself with all the X's in the front for security purposes. Now, when you do, if this person is already in the MTRS system, it's not going to say no match found. It's going to say their name, right? And some of their data is going to be pre-filled here because they're already in MTRS. Now, if they've never been a teacher before, then you're going to get this message saying there's no match found, and it's going to require you to put in all their information. So in this case, for my mock-up, I was registering Melita. So Melita is being set up as a teacher, and we're going to go through and just show you the steps for this. So then on the next step for Melita, I put in her phone number and email, pretty straightforward. Then I'm going to answer a bunch of questions regarding her employment. So this is when she's starting, again, with the MTRS eligible position, her position itself, what her FTE is, what her full-time, full-year salary is. We explain that in the little blurb that's right on the screen for you. You also tell us when the first time they're going to get paid as this position so that our system can anticipate when it should see her first deduction. You're also going to tell us how many months a year she's required to work in her position, how many pieces you're going to break her salary into. You pay over 24 pays, no problem. Just list 24 there, you're good to go. And then whether or not at the end of the school year you give them a lump sum. Some schools, I know charter schools, I think do this a little bit less than the municipals, but you can have LS for lump sum. You can have 12 if you're going to pay them overall 12 months. You just basically list that information out for us. So this again helps us anticipate things for deduction reporting. When you hit next, you're going to go to the next step. This is where some conditional stuff happens. So I have a couple of small boxes at the top broken out. So the first thing we're going to ask is, are they required to have a license to be employed? Okay, so this is where we're talking about DESE. Now, again, with charter schools, you're going to say no more than municipal school districts are, right? So if you say no, they're not going to be required. Well, we're not going to ask you about the license. You just said that they don't need one. Now, if you say yes, you're going to get more questions. Okay, you require a license, but they're not certified. Is it pending? Is there a waiver, or has it been issued, right? So if you're hiring somebody who's not eligible by position, they're not a classroom teacher, but they got a waiver, right? Don't choose not certified. Choose received a waiver. That way we're not chasing down eligibility questions for no reason. Okay, we get that a lot. We don't want to waste your time. We don't want to waste our time. Make sure you're picking the right position here. And you'll see conditionally the fields below it will populate. So if you say yes, it's been issued, then we're going to ask you for the number, the date it was issued and issued by, and DESE. Okay, there's also an AHP option in there if they're an occupational or physical therapist. So once you've given us this information, you're going to go to the next step and you're going to get a summary of everything. Please take a look at everything while you're here. I know it probably seems like a superfluous step, but you'd be surprised. Sometimes people look at this and they're like, oh, geez, I screwed up the person's SSN. Hit cancel, abort, do it over. If you've messed up other things, you can always hit previous and go back through and make changes. For instance, if you screwed up spelling something or messed up their email address, whatever the situation is. All right. Now, presuming everything is okay, you're going to click confirm and we're going to go to the next step. Now here, I told that the director of the enrollment team that I would very subtly point out the picture here where you're going to email out the link to your members. So you can have two options here. One, you can create a sheet. We're going to show you what that looks like. The second one, I cannot say enough. So many people are getting registered and then they don't email the fact that they've been asked to enroll to their employees. There are so many that are not getting triggered. Please make sure you're completing your part of the process by emailing them to tell them that they need to enroll. Now, in the first step here, which you want to do before you send the email, if you want to pop up a copy of their enrollment, mandatory enrollment sheet. Now, folks, every year they're getting audited by DESE and they come scrambling to us saying, oh, geez, I need to find proof that I registered my people on time. The whole point of the DESE process is to make sure you're following the law and chasing people down for their enrollments and registering them on time. So when you're going through this process, keep a copy of the assignment sheet. We're not supposed to be giving it to you. That circumvents the point and the process of DESE making sure that you're following the law. So please don't ask your employer services representative for these. You should have copies of them. You can either have them on paper or you can have them electronically. Now, if you emailed your employee, like I'm really hoping you did with the subtle arrows, you'll get an error, you'll get a confirmation message, pardon me, you can see in the blue margin here where it says email has been sent to your member. So now that's telling you, yep, we did send it. We're confirming that we've done so. Okay. You can feel free to pop out a copy of this. I'm sure Desi would love to see that you emailed them during the process. I also wanted to point out in the top arrow that you're seeing there in the browser I was using when I created the enrollment sheet, it came up as a second tab and I had to click into it to see it. So I know occasionally I get a question where people are like, I'm trying to create this tab and it's not showing up. Look to see if it creates an extra tab that you might have to click into to get the assignment sheet that I showed you a couple slides back. Okay, so once you've created, you've hit the email link, you got your confirmation, you're good to go. You can hit close and now you can move on to your next person. And even though it took a while to explain this, really it takes a couple minutes, especially if you're comfortable going through it. Now, this is a copy of the email the employee is going to get. So we're going to say, Dear Melita, we need you to go and enroll. Here are the steps. Go to our website. You can click on enroll in the MTRS, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to show you what she sees when she clicks on those. But before so, I just want to talk about enrollment just a little bit and what the requirements are. First, employers are required to have their employees enroll within 30 days of their eligibility date. Okay, so that's by law. You're required to make sure that they do it as their employer. Again, why Desi's going to be asking you for proof. Enrollments are basically like the foundation of their membership, right? This is where we're collecting all their data. If you're opening a bank account, you wouldn't just, show up and drop money on the counter and not fill out, information for a bank account. At least not unless you're a crazy person, right? You don't want to just leave your money there. Well, it's the same kind of thing. You don't want to be sending us contributions. We don't even know really who you are, right? So think of that as what enrollment is. They're petitioning us for membership. Now, we have a whole process. We're not going to process benefits for them if they haven't enrolled. And eventually, we're going to be reaching out to superintendents and directors saying, hey, look, you got a problem. You have these people who won't fill out their enrollment forms. So, and they're required to do so by law. We will also be directly contacting people who don't enroll. So on top of your efforts, please know we're also contacting them separately. And it's also important that it's clear that enrollment needs to happen every time someone switches employers, okay? Because again, when we were talking about separation of service and all that kind of stuff, people have to petition for membership every time they're separating from service. So once we've sent the link, the person gets to the system, they sign in or what have you, the enrollment process will automatically start once they log in. So if they create their their MTRS username and password for the first time and they have an enrollment requirement, they can't even see their homepage yet. We're going to push them right into the enrollment form and make them fill it out. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. And then, some of the stuff we're asking for during enrollment, we're looking for updated personal information. There are some other statistical things we need to collect for actuaries and that sort of thing. But again, pretty basic employment stuff. Now, the link from their site, if they follow that, they're going to go to members. They're going to come to this page where it says enroll in the MTRS. And you're going to see that we give them information about enrolling, information about their benefit. There's actually a video. I know this is a static picture, but up here, up in the, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse, but there's a little section there where we give them a video to explain them their benefit. And underneath there are two buttons where they can sign in or they can create an account. That's going to bring them to a version of MTRS that's going to look very much like the portal you use. The only difference here, as you can see, if you look closely, is it says member self-service instead of employer self-service. So very, very similar to what you're looking at. And because they need to enroll, it's going to immediately pop them into one of our wizards. Yeah, I haven't seen one of these before. So it's going to walk them through step by step each process. We're going to ask them for their SSN, their date of birth. We're going to ask them some other questions. But you can see this form's pretty straightforward. We're just going to ask them to complete some information. If they fail to do a required form, it's not going to let them go to the next step. And if they fill this out, it should take somewhere between 5 and 20 minutes. They can do it on their phone if they want to. So MTRS is compatible with Safari. So there's really not a whole lot of excuses why they don't fill this out in a pretty timely manner. Now, when they do, they can get an enrollment confirmation. Now this might be a good thing to collect for that DESI audit. So you can have your employee provide you proof that they filled out their form. So if they're like, oh yeah, I did it. Okay, great. Give me your copy of your enrollment confirmation form. Now they might come back to you and say, oh geez, I didn't know the importance. I didn't print it out. No problem. They can sign back into MTRS. If they go to documents, they can always get a copy of this form, print it out and give it to you. Or they can save it as a PDF and email it to you. Now, they do also get an email confirming when they set up their access, but you don't want to collect this email. This has their username on it. That gets a little icky. You don't want that information. That's really between them and, and the MTRS. So stay away from that. But you do want to get the confirmation form from them. That is the perfect piece of evidence that you have followed through with your employees and met the legal requirement. They also can't be enrolled unless you register them. So even if you just have the enrollee confirmation form, you should be good to go with DESE as far as doing your stuff in a timely manner. Now, once your members have been registered, they don't even have to do the enrollment part before you do this. If you click onto your roster when you're in MTRS, you can look up any of your employees' profiles. This is where you can see their different events. They're going to start out as a contributing member. We're going to go through event maintenance, like if you're going to put them on leave of absence, that kind of stuff, in a different training. That's going to be in the cred service section. We're almost done today. And you can also see their name in the top right in the arrow that I'm showing there. You can see their MTRS membership number. And then below, you can see what their contribution rate is. So the moment you've registered them, and I'm hoping you're doing this during onboarding, you can immediately figure out what their contribution rate is to make sure you got them in your payroll system correctly. So there should never be a need to have to ask us, because if you're onboarding them, you got them in the system's going to tell you exactly what rate to take. Okay.
If a current member was enrolled with no licensure needed, how can we change it to yes if it applies? How do we go back and correct it?
So if you have a situation where the information is incorrect, or maybe they're even in a different position that now requires licensure, reach out to your assigned employer services rep and provide them the information, and they can update their record for you. If you discover, I was going to say you could re-register them, but it won't re-pull out the information. If you discover it immediately, like, oh, geez, I just did this one wrong, you can re-register them immediately, and the system won't reproduce the form, but it will allow you to re-enter the information correctly. But you have to do that before they enroll for it to pick up. Otherwise, it'll block it, saying this person's already your employee. So those are two opportunities. But if it's, a little time has passed and you realize you did it wrong, you can reach out to your employer services rep, and we'll collect the information and post it to your employee's account. Okay, so we talked about rates. I know I'm a little bit over. Sorry, I didn't time this all too well, but we only have a couple more slides. We're going to talk about a program called, first we're going to talk about how rates are determined, and then we'll talk about Retirement Plus, and then we're good to go. So first, rates are determined based on when somebody started in the system, what their continued membership is. So if they switch employers, it doesn't reset automatically unless they refunded service, okay? But the second factor is whether or not someone's in Retirement Plus. Retirement Plus was introduced in 2001. People who were in the system got an election, and other people didn't. So everybody who joined the MTRS with no prior service after 2001 is required into MTRS, or excuse me, into the Retirement Plus benefit. Okay. If you have somebody who's transferring in service from another contributory retirement board, that's when the Retirement Plus question can become a little more complicated. So you've hired them as a charter school teacher, but they used to be somebody else's teacher's aide, or they were working as a police officer, or they worked for DESE, whatever the situation is. They could have some grandfathering rights. Now, this changed a little bit over the 20 years. So when it first came out, if they were first establishing membership with us, they were an 11% member. Then, if they had funds on account with another board, we were required to give them an election. So what you're going to see is the Retirement Plus benefit allows for an enhanced benefit. And if they started after July 1, 2021, and they transfer in service, we gave them an election. Okay. Now, that one-time election is somewhere where they had to say, like, okay, we've kind of got two conflicting parts of the law. You can qualify in and bring your old grandfathered rate in if you'd like, or you can participate in Retirement Plus. We need you to choose. And if folks didn't choose, it was treated as a no election. And those elections are final and irrevocable. Okay. Now, that became a bit of a problem because you're asking a lot of folks about their membership, and they're like, been a teacher for like 5 minutes. And so they have many other things on their minds, not their retirement. A lot of them are very young. And so it led to a situation where you had a lot of people who were defaulting out and didn't really fully understand that they were defaulting out. So in 2022, the legislature passed a bill and it did a couple things. One, all the people all the way back to 2001, if they were in this limbo status and got pushed out of the Retirement Plus, they got an option where they could elect in again. They gave them 6 months to do so, which was the original amount of time people were given back in 2001 when there was Retirement Plus. And so basically said, okay, we're going to give you one last chance to go for this. A lot of people did. I think we gave the election to something around 7,000 people. There was a good percentage of people. More than 1,000 people were allowed the opportunity to Retirement Plus. It was fantastic. And for folks who are out now, they can't say that they weren't given a shot. They got the original election and then they got this re-election. We tried to do everything we could to reach out to them. So hopefully we have put that to bed. Now, the other thing that got created by this law, right, is it created a situation where if folks are starting after July 1st, 2022, if they are transferring in service, so anybody who never had any prior service, they're 11, they're in Retirement Plus, they're good to go. But if they're transferring in service, the question is the transfer coming in, if it predates 7/1/2022, right? So we don't pull the rug out from people when they're already in the retirement system. Those folks are going to get an election, okay? And we're going to default them to yes, but they have the right to say no. If they are transferring in service that started after July 1, 2022, which is going to be a growing population going forward, then those folks are not given an election. They're just treated as a Retirement Plus teacher like everybody else is. They're at 11, they're in Retirement Plus, and hopefully we will put to bed the situations, sometimes tragic, of folks saying, look, I didn't understand, how important that election was and that sort of thing. Now, Retirement Plus is a bit complicated, and I know I kind of went through it in a little bit of a high level here. So please know that we do have Retirement Plus resources available. A gentleman by the name of David Prococo did some videos on this very directly during the election process, very detailed. We're working on the calculations for the people who elected in. We're working on making sure that we have received them all and we process them right. For people who are listed, who have been enrolled for a while, they're listed, maybe they're at the wrong rate. We're working on those too, so we're trying to get through it all. It's also very difficult because we have the deduction reporting backlog, so please work with us to get that resolved as quickly as we can. We've bulked up staff in the Employer Services Unit to try and help with that process. So hopefully we can all work together and get more and more. We'll see this kind of calm down and we'll get rates corrected in the system. And so with that, I can't say enough. You guys are a big part of what we do. Keep in mind, we're providing this benefit free to school districts. So I know that there's some paperwork. I know there's some complication, but on the bright side, this is a gift from the Commonwealth, right? So as we mentioned and detailed in more spoke about in more detail last week, if you didn't catch last week's presentation, you can download it from the website. I could see why you wouldn't want to do that today. An hour is enough for me. I totally get it. So, but you can pull that anytime. But please know, we're partners in this process. All we want to do is collect information about your employees and provide them the benefit that they've earned. Okay. And then last but not least, if you find yourself in the situation that the young lady in this slide is in, please reach out for help. Okay. So every school district has an assigned employer services representative. Utilize them. Even if the question is not about the thing that they do, they will connect you with the right person if they need to pull in somebody with a different area of expertise, okay? If you're not sure who your employer services representative is, there's a general box you can get the Employer Services Unit, which is empsup@trb.state.ma.us. empsup is short for employer support. We don't even make you type out all the words, right? empsup, and then add our regular tail, okay? So that will get you in contact with the Employer Services Unit. If for some reason, maybe your rep's on vacation, maybe your rep is, you're not sure who your rep is, you can always reach out and we'll make sure we connect you to the right resources. So with that, thank you all for joining me. I'm sorry, I know I went late on this one. We'll have to time this for longer if we do another set of these. We do have other training sessions coming up. I know we talked about that in the beginning, but I hope you found this helpful. I'm going to stick around for a minute or two just to see if there are any other questions.
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Can you still elect into this program? I'm assuming Retirement Plus. I am from another mass retirement and trying to get into MTRS in my new charter school role.
Okay, so can it be elected? That's a great question. So the question would be, if you're MTRS eligible, we deem you to be MTRS eligible, and whether or not that's forward moving or if it's even retroactive. So we'll work with you on that. So let's say you're MTRS eligible. Now you have funds on account with another mass retirement board. Great. If your service predates 7/1/2022, not only not only can you elect, we're going to require that you elect, right? We're going to send you a package saying, hey, you used to have service with XYZ town. We've received your transfer. Now you have 180 days. If you fail to elect, you're going to get pushed into Retirement Plus. Okay. Now, Retirement Plus is not always great for everybody. So please make sure you read through the materials, make sure it applies to you. And if you want an exception out, you will get that option. Now, if you started with that other job after July 1, 2022, you are in Retirement Plus mandatory. You do not get an election, even though you have prior service at another board, because that's what the law change did. So it requires people in. Anybody who does not have any prior election service is in Retirement Plus automatically. It is now the default benefit. And it has been the default benefit really for a long time. It was this service transfer in thing that kind of well-intended but complicated things. All right, we don't have any other questions. So thank you all for joining us. For those of you who have not had lunch yet, please eat lunch. And I hope you all have a great Wednesday.